Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us again today. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and I'm also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, a body corporate management company in Queensland, and I'm your host for today's session. Craig Welsh and Marcus Munstermann from QIA Group are joining us today to discuss the requirements to maintain the building while still keeping an eye on possible upgrades. Craig and Marcus will talk about strategies for sustainable asset management. With growing discussion in the media surrounding strata levy increases driven by inflation and the rising cost of living, this session will provide valuable insights. Craig and Marcus will guide you through the essential elements of effective financial planning. Understanding these requirements will assist you in meeting the legislated obligations for regular maintenance and unexpected expenses, while also staying ahead of the curve with future innovations. We'll explore how these innovations not only influence the ageing and performance of your building, but also shape the preferences and lifestyles of building owners in the years to come. The information will help your committee to make informed decisions that strike a balance between meeting immediate needs while still preparing for evolving demands of the strata community. Today's webinar is national. We draw your attention to the fact that strata legislation does differ for each state. Before we begin, as always, I'd like to mention that the information in this session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in this session. So today we're really happy to welcome back Marcus Munstermann from QIA, and Marcus is a foundation member of QIA Group and has been involved in the strata industry for over 20 years. He has a wide and varied working background in the property industry, working in real estate, project marketing, as a building manager with management rights over a 94-lot scheme, and specific experience in body corporate management and consulting. He holds a business administration and work health and safety qualifications. And Craig Welsh, also from QIA Group. Craig has 25 years of experience in property development and construction, including the development and construction of large-scale strata properties from inception, facilities management of educational facilities and resorts. And Craig holds qualifications in commerce, construction and workplace health and safety. So I'd like to welcome both of you to the session today, Craig and Marcus.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Great. Okay, so just wanted to start off by saying that we'll be looking at it in two parts. What we're trying to do is to say we need to establish a baseline for your properties, and then we need to look at upgrades sort of going forward. I think our first little bit of business is to, again, a little disclaimer to basically say that this is for educational purposes, and we're really just trying to get people up to speed with the vibe of the thing, as opposed to all of the detail, which you'll need to consult experts for, and there'll be, I think, room for some legal advice as well going forward. So again, just trying to give you an overall sort of a background. In the first instance, we're looking at maintenance planning and upgrades, and we call them strata titled buildings because across the various jurisdictions there are lots of different titles for owners, corporations and bodies corporate and strata companies. And so we're going to go with the strata titled buildings as the main method of identifying. I've got a couple of key reference terms, again, just trying to make sure that we are good across all of the various states. So we'll look at common property a lot. We call a strata titled property. And then we've got infrastructure. We're talking mainly about common property infrastructure there. We talk about strata title legislation. That's the various acts that deal with how a body corporate is managed, or an owner's corporation. We've called a maintenance plan, sinking fund plan, capital works fund plan, reserve fund plan, a 10-year plan. Hopefully everybody will be able to work with that one. And then we've also got something called a maintenance schedule, which in some states and territories is prescribed, and in others it'll just be a very good way of being able to understand what you have and setting out the maintenance schedules. And then we talk about upgrades themselves. So again, an upgrade is something that's very much driven usually by either cost or legislation or incentives, something like that. And it's not normally factored into, say, a 10-year plan or a maintenance schedule, which is more concerned with the actual maintenance of the items that you have currently. So strata title property, I think most people will be familiar with what that might be. But again, just going over it, it's lots and common property. I think what's important is that owners maintain their own lots to a particular standard that they're happy with, and that owners have an understanding that there's common property and that it needs to be maintained, but how it's maintained, to what level, what standard, isn't quite as sort of uniform as, say, a person looking after their own lot. So I think that's also just an important distinction to know. And owners will also need to understand that there'll be a lot of changes going forward, particularly in the next 5 to 7 years. And the common property will need to incorporate technologies and trends and legislative requirements on a much larger scale than I think has been the case in the past. So from our perspective, we see it all the time. Uh-oh, Craig needs to leave the room. So from our perspective, maintenance happens and we see it all of the time. And it's not necessarily all that clear to owners as to what's going on and why it's going on, and the service intervals for pieces of plant and equipment and things like that going forward. So what we tend to find is that there's no real approach or standard that's adopted for maintaining a building going forward. It's much more on a reactive basis. And unfortunately, we tend to find that building maintenance is often approached by what we call a very singular focus, which is just cost. So cost itself doesn't really provide either the best solutions, and it doesn't really identify the drivers for maintenance a lot of the time. So if you were to take, say, repainting a building into account, you'd say, okay, let's look at the cost drivers there. The building repaint, if you have a look at it, costs are largely driven by labour. The painter, the cost is small. So given that the painting is often the single biggest cost for a building, reducing the labour cost for repainting should be the focus for owners. And so if you're leaving painting for an extended period of time, what you're then doing is tending to drive up the labour costs, because the preparation time will just be that much longer, and you'll often then encounter other problems with water ingress that you would otherwise not encounter if you had a schedule, stuck to that schedule, and maintain the building accordingly. So it's really about establishing what those drivers are very early on and dealing with them. And that's where, I'd say, a 10-year plan will be of assistance. So when we look at a building maintenance framework, again, it's generally very high level. So there will be a building code and standards which will give you guidance as to how a building is built. And with a little bit of supervision from private certifiers along the way, we end up with a building that's well built. And inside the National Construction Codes, something called the Building Code of Australia, it sets out minimum levels for things like safety, health, amenity, accessibility, and sustainability of certain buildings. The Australian standards provide a little bit more detail. So if you have a look at one for, say, fire equipment, it'll give you maintenance intervals, identify what the various items are, and the I suppose, how they need to be maintained, whether there'll be critical defects, how that needs to be managed going forward, all of those things. So the Australian standard will tend to focus a lot of the time on essential services that need to work at a particular time. And then we'll have strata title legislation, which really talks about the common property being maintained in a good and serviceable manner all of the time. And then from time to time, you'll have a specific issue that will come up, say things like smoke alarms or pool fencing, or eventually what will be happening with, say, EV charging going forward, which will then drive a need to change and then in future maintain a building. So there's a general framework there. It doesn't give you specific guidance as to how to maintain a building going forward. That sort of comes from a lot of different sort of disparate sources, which then need to be pulled in to a document like a 10-year plan or a maintenance schedule. But again, these things give you a general sort of a guide as to how things need to be built, and then some things to be maintained. So I think it's very important to understand building maintenance as a process, because it's something where you really have to step through it. You need to start at the start and work your way through to the finish to actually get somewhere. Otherwise, you're going to be in a position where you're starting in the middle and you haven't necessarily identified all of the items that you need to going forward. So I think it's very important to, in the first instance, you identify what needs to be maintained and in some ways the risks that need to be managed with that. So if a fire extinguisher doesn't work, that is a risk going forward. It is going to be quite a problem. Then you need to assess the condition of the common property, buildings, plant equipment, facilities, infrastructure, those sorts of things. Then we prescribe a suitable maintenance standard or intervals. And from that, again, is it essential? If we have a look at something like water ingress, which is one of the worst problems a building can have, this would help in terms of prioritising. So your roof, gutters, downpipes, those sorts of things, painted finishes really contribute to the watertightness of a building and stopping things like rot and cracks opening up and water getting in and damaging internal lots and those sorts of things. So you prioritise that way, and then it comes down to funding. So you'll have your short-term costs, which are usually going to be sort of sitting in your administration funds, and then things like power, cleaning, those sorts of things, and your longer-term replacement costs. And then you'll need to review and revise your budgets. Again, that happens on an annual basis to a certain extent, but I think going forward with the pressures that are going to be coming into play with respect to upgrades, you're going to need to look at that a little bit more closely, definitely. So again, as part of the overall process, it's very important to understand your baseline building maintenance costs, so that you can put into perspective future costs going forward for upgrades, which are going to sit outside of those baseline costs. So in the first instance, you need to maintain what you have. And then in that second instance, you're going to have to look at what happens in terms of maintaining or replacing those things going forward, because every replacement will probably present an opportunity. So we define what we have and then how we can maintain it going forward. And then again, we can see that's a very useful way of seeing what the true costs are going to be. So again, I think that's Craig in the background. Yeah, so we'll have a look at a maintenance schedule and then a 10-year plan. Again, maintenance schedules are prescribed in a couple of states and territories, and really what they're about is going through the common property and itemising each item of plant and equipment, where it's located on the site, and then you provide information as to the type. So it's a fire extinguisher, it's a dry chemical extinguisher, it's sitting in the foyer and the basement, it was in the stairwell. Then we have a look at the current level of maintenance. Say there'll be a tag on there which says it's been inspected every 6 months. And there might be some records on site and a logbook, which gives you some further information. Then the next thing you do is document the maintenance intervals for these pieces of equipment. So again, with that fire extinguisher, every 6 months and every 5 years, you'd be looking at a pressure test. There's a standard for a lot of things. If not, there might be a code of practice or some manufacturers' recommendations, say with pumps, all those sorts of motors. It'd be something you'd look at, say, every 12 months. You might clean out a pump pit in a basement every 12 months as well, to make sure that the pump's just not sucking through dirt and all of the things that are going to actually prevent it from working. We'll also, you then provide some details as to the relevant parties providing the maintenance. And from that, you get an approach to maintaining the common property and get a little more of an understanding of what it takes to maintain a building. And you have an interface document which you can discuss quite concretely what the building has, how it needs to be maintained. If you don't have that kind of a document, the conversations can tend to be a lot more ad hoc and a little bit more difficult to manage. And again, it's a place of capturing all of this information going forward, because history is often something that buildings lack with respect to the plant and equipment and how it's been maintained going forward. It can also assist in life expectancy for those pieces of plant and equipment, and ensuring that warranties or guarantees provided by the original developer or owner can actually be relied upon, which can also be something of a problem if the maintenance doesn't happen. In a 10-year plan, I think most people are familiar with, say, a sinking fund or a capital works fund or a 10-year plan. And essentially what we're looking at there is dealing with the longer term replacements. We tend to look at things like, let's see, fire panels and sensors and those sorts of things as a system, and including that in there. There's something that needs to be maintained by the owners. And again, larger items of plant and equipment, and just setting all that down, giving some basic ideas of the funds that are going to be needed to carry out these replacements going forward, and then some general sort of timing as to when that's all going to be happening. And if you've got your maintenance schedule, that becomes a little bit easier as well. And I suppose what's also very important to consider is that upgrades generally aren't considered as part of a 10-year plan, mainly because what's there needs to be maintained, and that's easy to understand in terms of scope. And there isn't much discussion a lot of the time as to the fact that it has to be maintained or how it has to be maintained. With respect to upgrades, there's a myriad of different things that can be done to different levels. Very difficult to price it without a scope and without agreement from the owners in the first instance. So that's generally why that happens. So I suppose also what's very important, now that you've established your baseline, you have a good understanding of where the building sits in terms of this is what it's going to cost going forward just to maintain what we have. I suppose what's very, very important as well going forward is to consider things like lead times, particularly with more sophisticated pieces of plant and equipment for buildings that have lifts. It might take a while for the parts to actually appear. And then it might take quite some time to install all of those parts on site. And there are going to be significant disruptions to consider, as well as very significant costs. So again, what we're looking at there is making sure that we've got some funding in place, but then thinking about it earlier rather than later. So where your lift maintenance providers are coming back to you and saying, look, it's harder to get parts, the lift's breaking down a lot more, it's less efficient than it can be. Taking those considerations on board earlier on in the piece means that you can start planning for those lift replacements earlier on and avoiding some of the real pitfalls, because a multi-storey high-rise without a lift is not a great place to be if you're walking up and down those stairs all of the time and having to listen to owners coming to you and saying, yeah, why wasn't this dealt with earlier? And again, things like a standalone electric vehicle charger, you might be able to get one of those for, say, $1,500, and then you need to install it. And that's great for one vehicle. And that will probably be tolerable in terms of the capacity for the building. But when we're looking at most vehicles being electric from sort of 2028 to 2030, there's a lot we have to plan for going forward, which is going to be much more substantial. And we need to get some basic planning and some provisional funding underway as well, because the lead time and the cost will be significant. So again, I think it's very important to establish what we'll be looking at in terms of the upgrade process. Again, given that we understand, generally speaking, what drives maintenance in the first place, and that is things wearing out over time and having to service those items. The next part of the process is going to be upgrading, and with upgrading, the drivers are going to be somewhat different. So as a process, I think it's a very, very good idea to understand that we need to have a look at those drivers. In the first instance, define a scope. We're talking small scale, large scale upgrades going forward. All this is very general. We'll get a little bit more specific going forward. Establish the capacity. Do you have the space? Do you have the energy? Output requirements. Do you have things in places where they need to be? A lot of that'll be, age and size of the building and construction type. Are there incentives out there to go and do something? Because that can also be a driver to get something done sooner rather than later. Staging is also, I think, a very meaningful consideration in the overall process. Starting off simply coming to terms with the technologies that you're coming up against, working small scale, then moving towards something larger scale is a very decent approach going forward. And then we're looking at the funding side of things, very much who pays and how, and also trying to, again, ease into it without overburdening everybody in the first instance. So I suppose in terms of upgrade drivers, we've identified quite a few, and there are key ones here. So we have legislation. So a lot of the time, I suppose, with what's going on with climate change and emissions targets, this is very much a do it because we've got targets to meet and everybody will get dragged along. we'll be going from a centralised coal-fired sort of grid to a more decentralised grid. There'll be a lot more power generation going on at building level, particularly for smaller items. And then, you know, again, I suppose there's also a driver which will see people getting into electric vehicles and then coming to buildings and saying, well, I need to charge my car. How am I going to do that? Next thing is going to be cost. So a lot of the time, a lot of upgrades can be done because the principle is that energy prices are going up. So if we use less, then that's going to be beneficial to us over time. And you know, there'll be things like LED lighting and things like that. And then there will be incentives. You'll find the government's basically trying to get us to start using newer technologies. They're not produced at scale, so they're expensive. How are we going to get people to take up these new technologies at scale? Incentives are going to be a way forward. So those sorts of drivers sitting there in the background, identify those. That gives you a good understanding as to why people want things and who's going to want them and how much of it. So the next thing we have to do is develop a scope going forward. That's going to be a little bit more tricky because, again, depending upon your approach and things like the availability of the various items that you need to get going forward, the reliability of the technologies, is it proven? Is it adaptable? If you get on the bandwagon a little bit too early, are you going to find out that you're the proud owner of, for people that are familiar with video, a beta as opposed to a VHS? Beta died out, VHS went forward. There's going to be one of those sorts of things as well. So again, staging can be very helpful. You know, can work to be staged as well. Then we have the urgency. Is there something we need to do immediately? Do we have equipment that's failed and now we have choices? And then we have things like usage. So who's going to benefit from it? Is all the people in it going to benefit from it all? You know, are we just going to have a few? And how's that going to work over time? I think what's also very, very crucial to how you frame things going forward is going to be upgrade capacity. So very much determined by the age we're building, its condition, construction components, its general layout. And in that phase, you really are going to need to talk to professionals that can help you out. So in terms of energy, somebody can come past, see what capacity you have, see what wiring you have, and then maybe over time gauge your actual energy usage and see from that. So you've got infrastructure that says that you can have so many watts flowing through, but how many of those watts are you actually using? That will give you a good idea of what capacity you have in a building as well. And then as you move forward, you'll be looking at a need for upgrades and those sorts of things. And it's not just going to be just putting in a PowerPoint. It's usually going to be a lot more than that, because there are many considerations to take on board. You know, if you look at, say, EV charging, you get an initial audit. You'll have an understanding of what you can do. You can probably squeeze a couple of slow charging points in without too much of a requirement to upgrade. And then, say, a little way down the track, you might be able to put in, say, 4 if you have some load balancing equipment, which allows, if your first car's got 80% charge and your second car's got 50% charge, when that first car comes in, it's sitting on a trickle. When that second car comes in, it gets some faster charging, bringing it up to 80%. And then the other two, or those two vehicles then get charged at the same rate, but are slower. That can allow for more vehicles to be charged. And then again, you get to fast charging points and a greater requirement for capacity. So those are the sorts of things that, yeah, we need to sort of have a look at. And, as people are aware, there's incentives going forward for LED lighting, there's solar electricity generation, heat pump technologies, insulation options as well. So they're very much driven by what the government's trying to establish going forward in terms of meeting their larger goals. And then, of course, we've touched on it a few times, but that staging side of things. So I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit here in that I suppose getting to the crux of the matter is going to be about what capacity you have, how we're going to do it going forward, but getting professionals involved early on in the process so that we can deal with these sorts of things. And there's also, I think it's important to remember that while there be a greater requirement on the buildings grid, if you like, for things like charging of electric vehicles, there may be other pieces of technology that come in over time, such as solar-powered air conditioning units, which may take energy requirements out of the little grid for the building as well. So the owners are basically generating the power that's necessary and then using battery storage to run their air conditioning and maybe a few other parts of their own individual lot, which will take a load off the overall capacity requirements for a building. So yeah, there are just many little things that can be done as well. Single purpose items, you have hot water systems, garden lighting, stairwell lighting, all of those are all contributors, but they're small scale schemes that you can give the go ahead to without a great deal of research and thought as to how it might impact things going forward. So I think the last thing to sort of consider is going to be the funding side of things. And again, it'll really be about providing provisions in the first instance with a very general sort of a timetable, and then understanding that there are other funding options that sit outside of a 10-year plan. People can get loans, there can be special levies, combination of any of those sorts of things as well. But at least we've started the ball rolling. We have some funds in there to deal with some of the upgrades that we're looking at. And as time goes on, we can shore those up and become more precise and then choose the funding models that we actually want to use going forward. I suppose what's also very interesting, we'll be dealing with the human factors. I think there are studies out there saying that say for an EV charging point, most people will want that in their car space. That might not be ideal in terms of having 10 car spaces with 10 different chargers, 10 different wiring requirements, wattages, all running through a centralized infrastructure at some point might prove very difficult to manage over time. So it's going to be a matter, again, of considering those sorts of things, pulling in your experts to help you out with those things in the first place, and also just to help you avoid some of those pitfalls so that you can stage these things, help with your cash flows, and also make sure that you're not going down a dead end, because that would be quite a problem to deal with. So there'll be some interim solutions that will just be driven because something has to happen now, but it should always be viewed within the larger picture of what's going to happen in the future, particularly in the next 5 to 7 years. So from our perspective, we're here to help. we can provide a lot of reports to help identify what needs to be maintained, assess the condition of what we've got, and prescribe what we can in terms of maintenance schedules or advices as to how things should be maintained, and provide information as to the drawbacks of not maintaining them, and help in terms of prioritising maintenance, and also particularly with respect to funding, and helping people revise budgets. So if they decide that they want to have a look at what the impact of introducing EV charging is going to be going forward. They've got a sinking fund already. They'd just like to see what the impact's going to be. We can look at some very quick and simple reviews to their 10-year plans to give them an understanding of that impact, and give them some solutions as well for that. So I think it's the bulk of the presentation handled, and now it's really about addressing questions and seeing what else there is that you'd like us to talk about.
We do have some questions that were submitted to us, which I think were really great questions. So we will move on to those. But I'd like to let everyone know that there's obviously quite a bit of content in the slide presentation. So we will be sharing those slides with everyone later on today. And I do recommend that you go back and watch it again with the slides too and work through it, because Marcus has obviously provided us with lots and lots of information, and it's a really good chance to go through and process all of that information. I thought it was great when you mentioned the extra load, Marcus, to say we always talk about how putting new services in like EV charging puts this extra load on the building, and have to be very careful of that. But then I like the fact that you mentioned that there will be technologies in the future that will also possibly consider lighting that load as well and taking some of that load off. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think, I suppose more than anything else, it's just bringing into sort of sharp focus that the need for planning is more important now than ever, but that the technologies can be complementary and also beneficial to the overall energy landscape, if you like. So, and there's more and more of that popping up. I saw just a gate being installed, a sliding gate for an industrial property, and they have a gate motor. It has a battery. That battery is being charged by a single panel on a post. So it's not even anywhere near the grid, or and it's just that single purpose thing. So it's a small thing, but if you have a look at a lot of those things, adding those up, we can probably take some capacity out, which would be a great relief, I think, because a lot of people are just seeing, oh my God, what are we going to do next?
That's it. Yeah, that's great. And just because we have mentioned EV charging and electric vehicles in the session quite a bit, if everybody, I'm sure there are people in here that saw it, but a couple of weeks ago we had a session with Altogether Group that covered a lot of that EV charging in lots of detail, and the two sessions really work in well together because they fill in all those extra extra information about EV charging that we might not have had time to go into today. So we had a question from New South Wales to say, my neighbour and I self-manage our duplex. I do the spreadsheets that include administration fund expenses, owners' contributions, 10-year plan, budgets and sinking fund for our use and for the compliance with the Strata Hub. We've recently had some roofing problems. The roof wasn't even on our radar. So how do we budget for areas we can't access ourselves? Should we organise annual or biannual inspections? The required roof repairs really threw our budget out the window. Many of the discussions in the past webinars I've attended centred around really large complexes, and schemes with smaller number of lots or duplexes like ours seem to fall under the radar. So can you help?
Yeah, it's always a tricky one. It's very hard to plan for things that you can't see, and particularly when it comes to things like roofs, underground pipework, etc., etc. It's not all the same person. You've got a roofer, you've got a plumber, you've got an electrician. They're all looking at different things. But certainly any maintenance plan and any proposed funding needs to consider those items nevertheless. And yes, it pays to get a roofer up there every few years to have a look around and see what we can't see. We do, as part of our maintenance inspections, a rudimentary inspection of the whole site to identify any potential problems and perhaps suggest some ideas for dealing with those areas. But yes, they can't be ignored. You can see the paint, you can see the windows, you can see the doors. Yes, we would recommend some fairly low-key inspections of those other areas at times. If you've got a contractor there fixing something, if someone's there fixing the gutter, yeah, an extra couple of $100 will get them to have a bit of a look around at the roof while they're there and give you some advice. Some of it's long-term stuff. Tiles should last for a long time. But certainly those little problems, little leaks will be an indicator of bigger problems coming down the track.
And it's really about taking notice of what you see as well. Part of the problem is that you're living in a building, you're watching it age, it does so incrementally, you don't see big changes, so you think everything's fine. Having somebody else come out onto site with fresh eyes will say, well, that's not what it's supposed to be doing right now. You have, if you have a tile roof, you have ridge capping, which sits at the apex. That's held in by cement. And that cement breaks down over time. That really leads to water going straight in. And so everything ages, whether we like it or not, including ourselves. And the difference between, aging gracefully and not is really the amount of time and effort you spend on dealing with those aging issues. Water tightness in a building is, I would say, the biggest priority. But again, if you can't see the roof or if you don't know what you're looking at, you have people up there having a look at gutters and downpipes, keeping them clear. Do that on a routine basis, particularly if you've got a lot of trees, and then get somebody to have a look over the roof as well, because they'll pick up cracked tiles and things that need to be maintained. So yeah, have a 10-year plan. It'll mention it to a certain extent, and then get people out there periodically to do works.
Okay, thank you. That's a really great point. We had a really quick discussion before we went live about older buildings and how sometimes people use that as an excuse for the way the building's maintained. But you're saying that's not really an excuse in an older building?
No, it's like older people. They need a lot more care and attention just to make sure that they keep going forward. Older buildings, just, everything wears out. You really just need to be much more aware of it and attentive to it. Otherwise, it leads to way bigger problems. And they're really built to last for a long, long time.
Definitely. And we just had a comment that came in from a strata manager, I'd say, saying the challenges faced by proactive strata managers is trying to get owners corporations to get out of their "it's not a problem until it's a problem" mentality. So I think that's a good comment as well. Yeah.
So it's all about reacting, and we're reacting all of the time to things. I have to, sorry, one sec, go.
Yeah, we've got to be responsive to those things as they occur. So that's key.
Okay, and we've just had another question pop up to say our challenge is people not wanting to do anything because it costs too much. And we do have questions that come in quite a bit about people with problems with, say, a roof, and they really need a new roof, but the committee votes to repair the roof over and over again, and in the long run it just ends up costing more anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Little problems are an indicator of the bigger problems. And having been in construction for 25 years, I can tell you that they're much better off fixing them and fixing them properly while they're a little problem, investigating the rest and spending what you need to spend at the time, because it will cost you twofold, threefold down the track.
Yeah, and particularly when we're looking at things like upgrades, these, as things go wrong, they're starting to present opportunities to have a look at things like efficiency and with roofing, if we're changing over, do we get a long period of time where there's very little cost? We can also potentially look at insulation. A lot of the things that weren't there when the building was built, you have the opportunity to put there, and that just creates a much better energy efficiency profile and environment going forward. So we don't have to worry about the roof. at all for many, many, many years to come, and its eventual replacement, will be very easy to deal with because I've got 30 or 40 or 50 years to save up for it, as opposed to 5 where it's suddenly an emergency.
Definitely. Okay. All right. We had one from WA, and it was saying our 10-year plan has identified a litany of maintenance issues and recommended a 335% increase in our reserve fund contributions to address these needs over the coming decade. Our Strata manager and council of owners have rejected this advice, and they've increased the reserve contributions by just 30% and are refusing to consider any alternatives that would spare future owners a lot of financial pain. Can the Strata manager also be held liable for failing to act in the long-term interests of the Strata?
Okay, we'll stay out of the can they be held liable. That's a legal question, and I'll suggest you get some advice elsewhere for that. Look, it can happen, particularly in these states with changing regulations where a lot of buildings haven't had reserve fund plans, etc. in the past. It's a new thing, so some of this stuff can be a little bit surprising. The short answer is the building has to be maintained legislatively and from a common sense point of view. 330% over 10 years is a lot of money. 30% a year will get you there, but that's only one way to go. It's all about priorities. It's all about dealing with the most urgent things first. And looking at it, sincerely and say, okay, well, there is no other way. And if there is no other way, then that's the answer. You want to be doing it progressively. You want to be discussing it amongst all owners and coming up with a general plan that you agree with, and finding a way through, because the answer is if the maintenance needs to be done, unfortunately, it needs to be done.
Yeah, and I suppose the biggest problem with states and territories that don't have anything in terms of a 10-year planning environment, it means that the baseline's never really been established for the building. So what should you have been paying? While it's all fair and well to say there's been a 300% increase over a 10-year time frame, is that where it should have been in the first place? And in most instances, it's not. And the reason for the sharp increase, at least initially, is that there's a whole bunch of things coming. So you get to a building that's, say, 30 years old, there's a whole bunch of big cost items that are going to hit at the same time. There's your problem. Nobody's been taking notice of it and dealing with it in an incremental fashion. So now what we're dealing with is everything going wrong at once and a big cost in a time just after a pandemic where there's cost of living issues, all of those sorts of things. So, if you have a time frame of 2 years to do something, really hard work. If you have a time frame of 15 years to do something, you can deal with a lot of issues that are now facing people, and they just have no way out. It's pay up or we don't get the maintenance done. So, look, say with WA, where that legislation is relatively fresh, there's going to be a lot of those challenges going forward. And people are really going to have to sit down and have a look at the plans. Don't say the plan's the problem, because it's not. All it's doing is bringing everything to light. What should follow is a discussion. Okay, there's a lot of stuff coming up. Where do we turn to in terms of getting people who can help us with prioritising this? How much life is there left in certain things? So, there might be a big ticket item sitting there with respect to roofing. Get a roofer up there and they can probably provide you some indications as to how you can stage that cost, what's most important, and then feed that back into your 10-year plan, and you end up with something, again, a lot more meaningful, as opposed to sort of saying, we're not going to do much about it, or coming up with an arbitrary percentage, because at the end of the day, it's got to be based on something, and the 10-year plans are sitting there. They're legislated now because things haven't been based on anything in the past.
Yeah, there was just a comment in the chat. Someone asked a question. Surely the maintenance schedule goes hand in hand with the sinking fund. Yes, it does. The maintenance plan is all about sitting down going, what needs fixing? What have we got? What does it need and when does it need it? And the sinking fund, of course, is then about how do we pay for it. And yes, the two go hand in hand. It's some good, solid discussions about what do we need to do and when do we need to do it, and agree on that philosophy moving forward. And then once you've agreed on that philosophy, it's then just a case of, okay, what's it going to cost us? It's no different to setting a budget at home. It's no different to forecasting things on your own house. When am I going to paint? When am I going to upgrade my kitchen? When am I going to change my taps? And once you've made those decisions, you start to put some money aside.
If the committee sets up a 10-year plan and programmed maintenance, what happens in the future if those people leave? Can the plan still be maintained, or can a new committee vote it out? And I think that's a really interesting question, especially today when we're talking about these future upgrades and looking towards the future. If the committee makes a decision to go down the path of, say, EV charging, and they've set a plan in place, and then that committee changes over time, and then a new committee comes in and they don't agree with that, what happens in that situation?
Yeah, so I tend to split the terminology, and I call the 10-year plan a forecast, and I call the decisions that the committees make on an annual basis is their budget. So using the house example again, I can sit here today and I can say, okay, I'm going to paint the house next year, and the year after that I'm going to upgrade my bathroom, and the year after that I'm going to put an extension on the back. Well, next year comes and my hot water cacked itself, my plumbing's all blocked up, and there goes the bathroom, and there goes all those other plans. So yes, things change. The forecast changes, and then every year when you sit down to look at your forecast and you set your budget, if the two don't align, it's probably time to update your forecast. Whilst they align, life is good. You can keep trucking along. Your levies are still going to work. Your general plans are still going to work. You can set and agree on that budget. But if they don't align, it's time to relook at your forecast so that you can then again look into the future and go, yeah, we're going to have the money when we need it.
Yeah, and also look, there are going to be changes in terms of what I call loosely preferences. So there will be people that were saying, okay, the upgrade for these EV chargers, let's just say that that's budgeted in the first instance, and then the next committee comes along and says we don't want to do that. All of those things are in flux anyway, simply because while the budget says that we'll put aside $20,000 to spend on EV charging, you'll still have to have a discussion, motions, quotes, all of those sorts of things coming into play. So that will end up driving what happens at, say, the next annual general meeting, where you go, okay, well, look, yeah, we've decided that our budget's not going to include EV charging stations. Then the owners will actually have to sit down and discuss whether that's something that they want to do going forward. It won't just be up to the committee. And if all of the owners decide that they don't want to do that because they see other priorities, well, then it's just going to be an ongoing conversation in which you have a lesser and lesser time frame to deal with it. Because again, I think most car manufacturers are going to be all electric within 5 to 7 years. As much as that conversation is going to be painful in terms of levies, it's inevitable. Delay it for a few years. We can politic about it. We can talk about preferences and things like that. But again, those sorts of things are sitting there. And if you start talking to professionals, or contractors, electricians, people that provide these sorts of solutions, they can give you a lot of positive energy about all of these sorts of things, because they can tell you how to shortcut massive, huge levy increases and things like that, because there are lots of little things you can do. And the sooner you get involved in that conversation, it's the better off you're going to be. EV charging has its own issues. I mean, we're looking at, say, fire safety as well, where you've got battery storage. There's a technology that's still in its infancy. It'll get better. There are technological advances that are happening where people are actually using just aluminium for batteries. So a lot of these rare earths are going to be out of the picture. The aluminiums are less flammable and those sorts of things. So there will be technological change to make it better, but at least in the first instance, we know the batteries will have to sit outside where we can on the common property and things like that. But have all of those discussions. be informed because it's coming.
And that's where that staged approach probably comes into that you were mentioning as well. So look,
Yeah.
start working towards something, and then you've got a plan in place that you're working towards.
Yeah. And so initially, we don't have a lot of people with electric cars. So we have 1 or 2 charging stations. And then over time, we have more charging stations as more people adopt it. We get more comfortable with the technology. We get to see the costs. We see the little mistakes that we've made because they're not huge mistakes right now. We're moving along. The alternative is massive upgrade, late in the game, big cost, and a great deal of uncertainty.
And probably finding it hard to find people to do the work because everyone's scrambling around at the same time.
Well, yeah, there is that. Yeah. I was recently offered a quote to put an extra toilet into our industrial shed, and it came back at $48,000. Now, I still have not gotten to the bottom of what I was going to be getting for that $48,000. But I'm assuming there was some gold or precious metals involved, because wow. But people don't want the work. They're as busy as hell. They see it as messy because it's retrofitting as opposed to building something from scratch. There's lots of those sorts of things that then add to your lead time. If you start exploring early, get little bits and pieces under your belt, you become much more experienced, and it'll be a lot less nerve-wracking.
Okay. All right. Well, look, that was a fantastic discussion. Once again, we've just about hit the hour, so we might have to leave it. Hopefully we'll have you back again in the future. All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.